Welcome to See Crime Stories, true stories of the missing and the pursuit of answers. On a Sunday in early July 1997, a 38-year-old mother of three stepped onto a rented speedboat off Newport Beach and never came back. Her name was Peggy Beckler. By every verified account, she was strong, disciplined, an accomplished swimmer and triathlete, the kind of person who understood the water and respected it. Within hours, the Pacific would carry her status from out for a short celebration cruise to missing, presumed drowned, even though investigators could not anchor that conclusion to a single piece of hard physical proof. The trip itself was simple on paper. The couple left the harbor area in the afternoon on a small, open speedboat. The plan: celebrate, tow a bodyboard, enjoy the water a few miles off the Orange County coast. Only two adults were on that boat, Peggy at the controls and her husband, Eric, riding behind. According to Eric's statement, while he was being towed, a sudden wave knocked him into the water. When he surfaced, the boat was circling without a driver, and Peggy was gone. The immediate response followed standard procedure. Nearby boaters saw the unmanned vessel and helped bring it under control. Calls went out. Marine Patrol and Coast Guard assets were deployed. The search grid was established quickly in the waters off Newport Beach, an area busy with recreational traffic and well-charted conditions. Crews scanned the surface and the shoreline. They found no life jacket, no floating clothing, no injuries reported by witnesses who might have seen someone strike the hull or rocks. No body. When investigators checked marine and weather data for that day, they did not see evidence of an extreme event that matched the phrase freak wave or rogue wave as described. Conditions were not glass flat, but nothing in the official records suggested a violent surge powerful enough to silently remove one adult from a boat while leaving the other untouched and uninjured. Peggy's background as a competitive swimmer was documented and quickly entered into the file. The combination, common of seas, a capable swimmer, no trace recovered, did not qualify as proof of a crime, but it did not sit cleanly as a routine accident either. From the outset, there was exactly one direct eyewitness to what happened in those minutes between the harbor and open water, and that was Peggy's husband. His account framed the public narrative, a tragic boating mishap during a celebration run that turned fatal in seconds. Officially, agencies treated it as a missing person overboard case with presumed drowning. Unofficially, the absence of physical evidence, the victim's capabilities, and the precise convenience of having no corroborating witness were flagged, documented, and left waiting for something stronger. This is where the question begins, not where it ends. How does a healthy, experienced swimmer vanish in daylight off a monitored coastline, with no storm, no recorded rogue wave, and no body, only a story that cannot be independently confirmed? In this series, we will follow how that question slowly shifted from maritime tragedy to criminal suspicion, and how one cold, clean case file started to show edges. From the first report, the case file reads clean: missing at sea, adult victim, husband's statement, no body recovered. But in Orange County, investigators are used to pleasure craft accidents. They know what a real boating tragedy usually looks like on paper. Within days, this one doesn't line up as neatly as it should. Detectives start with the basics, confirm or break the only narrative they have. They pull weather data, tide reports, marine logs for July 6, 1997, off Newport Beach. Conditions show routine chop, normal boat traffic, nothing matching the idea of a violent, unpredictable surge swallowing one person and sparing another. It doesn't disprove an accident, but it undercuts the drama of the wave that supposedly changed everything. When one story leans on a force of nature, and the records say nature was quiet, that detail goes straight into the watch this column. Next, they build out who Peggy Beckler is on paper, not just in memory. Athletic background confirmed. Triathlons. Strong swimmer. Comfortable in deep water. No medical history suggesting sudden blackouts or seizures that might send her silently overboard. Investigators don't romanticize her, they document capability. A woman like this can still drown, but the probability curve shifts. A random fall with no impact evidence, no mayday, no struggle seen or heard in a busy recreational zone becomes statistically less comfortable. Attention returns to the man who came back. Eric Beckler's initial statement is taken, then taken again. Timestamps: when they left the dock, where they say they went, how long they were out, how long he claims to have been alone in the water before help arrived. On each retelling, the core remains: he was being towed, a wave knocked him off, when he surfaced, the boat circled, and Piggy was gone. It is the small adjustments, distance from shore, description of the wave, his movements after surfacing, that are logged. Individually, they could be stress, shock, bad memory. Collectively, investigators note a pattern they've seen before, a story that sounds rehearsed, not lived. They go to the boat. What they find is important for what it is and for what it is not. There is no clear evidence of a violent struggle. No obvious impact staining. No broken rail, no shredded clothing. Nothing that allows them to declare a homicide scene. It is also not the chaotic debris field that often follows accidental man overboard in panic, no repeated attempts to signal, no frantic radio calls from the reporting party, no trailing evidence of rescue efforts made too late. The vessel feels neutral, almost sanitized by circumstance. The data aligns too cleanly. Sometimes that is the problem. Financial and insurance information is pulled as standard protocol in an unresolved spousal disappearance. Policies on Piggy's life and on the couple's assets are identified and logged. Investigators do not draw public conclusions, and neither should we at this stage, but the timing, the amounts, and the pressure points in the Beckler's life are written into the narrative as context. In long-term relationships, crime, when it occurs, rarely appears out of nowhere. It grows in the shadow of debt, resentment, or control. Good investigators track those shadows without turning them into proof before it's earned. Privately, family members and friends raise quiet doubts. They emphasize Piggy's competence in the water, her commitment to her children, her discipline. Detectives listen, document, and separate emotion from evidence. Law enforcement cannot operate on a feeling that she would never. But when those close to a missing person consistently express that something is off, it reinforces the need to keep the file open, not buried under tragic accident. Still, even with flagged inconsistencies and concerns, there is a hard legal truth: no body, no direct witness, no physical scene that contradicts the husband's account. In the late 90s, without modern digital trails or expanded forensic tools, that reality matters. To file a murder charge, prosecutors need more than suspicion and patterns, they need weight. For now, the case sits in a narrow space, not closed, not forgotten, but stalled. This is the point where a lot of stories stop. A spouse disappears, an explanation doesn't feel right, families live with a question that never gets a real answer. For viewers who follow true crime, this early stage is critical. Are you willing to accept a version of events built entirely on the words of the only person left on the boat? In the official reports, Piggy Beckler is the missing party in an unexplained incident at sea. To understand why that file stayed open, investigators had to step off the boat and walk into her life. On paper, Piggy looked like stability. She was 38, a working mother, competitive, disciplined, the kind of person coworkers relied on and friends described as responsible. She juggled work, training, and 3 small children. The home image was active and bright. Pictures showed a fit couple, Southern California tan, an attractive young husband, ocean lifestyle, small kids on their hips. It played well from a distance. Detectives did what good detectives always do. They stopped looking at the photographs and started listening under oath. Friends of Peggy told them the relationship was not as balanced as it appeared. She was often the one holding the structure together. There were arguments about money. There were concerns about his choices, his spending, his commitment as a partner and parent. It was not a dramatic horror story of daily violence. It was a pattern of control, risk, and pressure that made her family uneasy long before she disappeared. Financial records gave those concerns weight. The couple's finances were strained. There were business ventures that did not deliver, debts that did not match the effortless lifestyle. At the same time, there were significant life insurance policies in place with Peggy as the insured party. On their own, policies are normal, even responsible. In the context of a sudden, unexplained disappearance at sea with no body recovered, they become part of a broader picture. Investigators logged amounts, beneficiaries, dates of issue, and any recent changes. They were careful. Having insurance does not make someone a killer. But when a potential payout fits hand in glove with a one-witness accident, it is not ignored. Witness interviews added another layer. A small number of people recalled comments from Eric that sounded like dark jokes about getting rid of Peggy or being better off without her. Jokes are not evidence, and they do not prove intent. They do, however, establish mindset and are treated that way. Detectives documented each remark word for word, who heard it, when, and how often. Patterns matter. When a spouse vanishes under suspicious conditions, prior comments about harm are no longer harmless. Investigators also looked at conduct in the aftermath, not to punish someone for grieving differently, but to see whether behavior aligned with the claimed trauma. They noted how quickly normal routines resumed, how financial matters were addressed, how aggressively paperwork related to Peggy's presumed death would be pursued. Again, each action alone could be explained. Together, they built a profile that did not fully match the role of a devastated husband still hoping his wife might be found. Through all of this, one fact did not change: there was still no body. No remains. No confirmed sighting. Nothing to send to a medical examiner. That absence limited what the system could do. There could be no autopsy to show drowning versus blunt force. No conclusive time of death. No toxicology. Without those anchors, prosecutors in the late 1990s were reluctant to file a homicide charge built mainly on character evidence and uneasy impressions. The case stayed open, but it did not move. For the families who lose someone this way, that limbo is its own kind of damage. They are asked to live with a narrative that doesn't sit right and a legal standard that won't let anyone speak definitively. One of the quiet purposes of revisiting cases like Peggy's is to underline that gap, the difference between what people feel in their gut and what the law can prove. In long-term relationships, especially where there is money and control on the line, those gaps can be dangerous if nobody is willing to keep asking questions. By the end of this phase, investigators had more than a tragic story. They had flagged insurance structures, prior remarks, financial pressure, and a marriage dynamic that did not fit the public image. None of it was enough to stand alone in court. Together, it was enough to make sure Peggy's disappearance did not get filed away as a closed accident. The file waited for something concrete that could either confirm the husband's story or break it. By the end of that summer, the search grids were gone, the reports were filed, and the case of Peggy Beckler sat in a narrow category, missing at sea under suspicious circumstances. Inside the Newport Beach and Orange County files, the early concerns were clear. Outside, the story remained what it had been on day one: a boating trip, a husband's account, and a woman who never came home. From an investigative standpoint, this is where reality hits hard. Suspicion is not enough. Detectives had reviewed the rental records, logged the route, checked the emergency response timeline, and interviewed boaters who helped bring the empty vessel under control. There was no independent eyewitness who could contradict the explanation given by the only person left in the water. There was no physical evidence to prove an assault, and no body to examine. That combination is exactly what makes a case like this so difficult to move forward. Behind the scenes, the file did not just sit in a drawer. It was evaluated as a potential nobody homicide. Supervisors and prosecutors looked at the same elements we've walked through: a strong, capable victim, a one-witness incident, financial pressure, insurance, prior comments that sounded reckless in hindsight. All of that went on the board. But in the late 1990s, a prosecutor stepping into court with nothing more than uneasy context risked losing the case outright. A failed prosecution would not only clear the suspect, it would make any future action nearly impossible. So the threshold was high. The legal issue was straightforward. Without remains, there was no death certificate based on recovered evidence, only a presumed death. Without a body, there was no autopsy to distinguish between drowning, trauma, or other causes. No time of death window to test against an alibi. No trace analysis to tie an object or location to lethal force. A jury can convict in a nobody case, but only if the state can present something solid enough to replace what is missing. At this point, they didn't have it. That didn't mean there were no moves being made. Any activity around Peggy's estate, custody, or insurance was monitored closely. Requests related to policy payouts or declarations of death were documented. Those steps are not crimes by themselves. Families need legal closure to function. But in suspected spouse cases, timing and urgency can speak loudly. Detectives watched for patterns. How quickly were documents filed? How assertively was a financial benefit pursued? How often did the surviving spouse lean on the narrative of accident to unlock money or remove legal obstacles? Those details were added, calmly and carefully, to an already uncomfortable picture. Internally, the case was treated as active but stalled. That distinction matters. It meant that tips would still be taken seriously. Any new statement from a witness, any shift in the surviving spouse's story, any disclosure from someone in his circle could be enough to trigger a deeper push. Cases like this depend on patience. When you cannot build downward into forensics, you sometimes have to wait and see if the people involved expose themselves over time. For Peggy's side of the family, this period was brutal. They were left with official language that stopped short of naming what they believed, and a practical reality that nothing more was happening in public. For investigators, it was a balancing act: protect the integrity of a possible homicide case without promising her relatives that an arrest was coming. In responsible true crime storytelling, we have to sit with that tension honestly. Not every red flag is instant proof. Not every bad feeling can be turned into a charge. But ignoring those signals is how dangerous people stay invisible. By the close of this phase, roughly the first couple of years after July 1997, one fact defined the file: there was a missing woman, Peggy Beckler, tied to a single unverified account, in a situation where natural explanations were possible but unsatisfying. Law enforcement had reasons to doubt, yet not enough to act. What kept this story from dying there was not luck, and not a sudden forensic breakthrough. It would be a human decision, made later, by someone who heard things they could not ignore. When a suspicious case stalls, the file usually waits in a cabinet. This one waited in someone's living room. Nearly 2 years after Peggy Beckler vanished off Newport Beach, the public image around her husband had shifted. On paper, he was the young widowed father who had survived a free day on the water. The official record still did not name him as a killer. There were no charges, no body, and no new forensic break. From the outside, it looked like life, some version of it, was moving on. Inside that new life was Tina New. Tina was a former model and actress who met Eric Beckler after Peggy's disappearance. She knew him as a man who had been through tragedy, raising children, trying to rebuild. That story can be disarming. People want to believe someone who says, "I've already lost everything." For a while, she did. What matters for this case is what she started to notice once she had time, access, and repetition, the things police never get from a single interview in a conference room. Alone with Tina, Eric retold the Newport story more than once. It was never presented as a confession at first. It was framed as a dramatic survival account, the same core outline investigators had heard: a day on the water, towing behind the boat, a wave, a fall, Peggy gone, the circling vessel, the search. But as the months went on, the edges of that outline would shift depending on the mood, the audience, or the point he was trying to make about himself. Details that should have been fixed, distance offshore, exact sequence after he hit the water, how quickly help arrived, were not fixed. For someone who claimed to have lived the worst day of his life, his recall was surprisingly flexible. Those inconsistencies alone would not reopen a case. People misremember under trauma, that is real. What made this different, according to later testimony, was tone and content. In private settings, Eric sometimes moved from tragic husband into something closer to performance. There were comments about outsmarting people, about the ocean, about what others were willing to believe. In certain conversations, the boating incident sounded less like an accident he regretted and more like a story he owned. Tina was not an investigator, but she was paying attention. She began to separate what made sense from what was there just to shock. Good true crime work respects that moment, when a civilian in someone's orbit starts doing what a formal interview can't, tracking patterns over time. She noticed that when alcohol or ego entered the mix, the language got darker. References to weight, to the ocean being a good place to lose something, to knowing there was no proof beyond his word, all registered. In isolation, any one line could be played off as tasteless. Collected, they started to look like data points. It is important to be clear, the evidence that will later anchor this case is not built on a single wild sentence. It comes from Tina observing a consistent gap between how Eric presented his role in public and what he allowed himself to suggest in private. When that gap got wide enough, concern turned into responsibility. She understood that if what he was hinting at was even partly true, this was not just about an old relationship or a bad argument. It was about a woman whose family still had no answers, and a justice system that had stopped just short of calling this what it might be. At the same time, law enforcement was still holding the file in that open but inactive posture. They did not know yet what Tina was hearing. This is where no-body cases often live or die. Without forensics, they depend on the choices people make away from cameras and official transcripts. In this story, the turning point would not come from a lab. It would come from the new partner realizing that those jokes, those changing versions, were not something she could keep to herself. People in the orbit of potential offenders are often the ones positioned to break a pattern. It is not easy to step out of comfort and into a police station, especially when the person you might expose has crafted a victim image. But in real cases, that decision can be the difference between suspicion that fades and a homicide that is finally named. By the time the relationship between Eric Beckler and Tina New settled into its own routine, the Newport disappearance was old news to almost everyone else. To Tina, it was background information, the tragic story he carried, the reason people seemed to handle him carefully. What changed this case forever was how he chose to talk about that day when he thought no one but her was listening. One night, in a private setting away from friends and children, the version of events shifted. According to what Tina would later tell investigators and a jury, Eric stopped describing Peggy's disappearance as an accident he survived and started describing it as something he controlled. The language moved from defensive to deliberate. He did not sound like a man replaying a trauma, he sounded like a man explaining how he had solved a problem. The details he gave her were specific. He talked about using a weight from exercise equipment as a weapon, striking Peggy, and placing her into large plastic bags. He described attaching roughly 70 pounds of weight so her body would sink and stay down. He described pushing her into the Pacific so there would be no body to find, no autopsy, no chance for investigators to prove anything beyond his original boating story. These are not embellishments added by storytellers, they are elements that came out later in court as part of Tina's recorded statements and testimony. If those words had come once in a single drunken outburst, they might have been dismissed. But Tina reported that it did not end there. Over time, in different conversations, Eric circled back to the same points: the use of weights, the bags, the ocean as a permanent solution, and the confidence that authorities had nothing solid without a recovered body. Some versions were cruder, some more calculated, but the structure remained recognizable. That consistency is what matters in an evidentiary sense. It is also what turned Tina from a sympathetic partner into a potential witness. From a legal perspective, statements like these are dangerous for the person who makes them, but only if someone is willing to repeat them under oath. From a human perspective, they put the listener in an impossible position. Tina was involved with a man now suggesting, in substance, that the mother of his children had not been lost to chance. She had to decide whether he was boasting, fantasizing, or confessing. That is not a theoretical exercise. It is about the safety of those children, the rights of a dead woman's family to the truth, and the risk that a man capable of doing this once might do harm again. It is important here to stay accurate. At this stage, there is still no body. There are no new physical exhibits pulled from the sea. What changes is that the no-body file finally has something it never had before, a claimed first-person account of intentional killing and disposal, heard by someone close enough to judge tone, context, and repetition. In modern true crime language, this is the pivot from "we suspect" to "someone inside his life says he admitted it." This is where the story stops being hypothetical. When a person describes a homicide method that lines up with earlier red flags, weights, deep water, confidence about the absence of evidence, that is no longer just dark talk. It becomes potential proof, if the system can capture it properly and withstand attacks on the source. Once Tina decided she could not ignore what she had been told, this stopped being a private problem inside a relationship and became the turning point of a stalled homicide investigation. She went to law enforcement and repeated, in detail, what Eric Beckler had described about his wife's disappearance. Detectives already knew the weaknesses in the accident at sea story. What they had never had was a person from inside his home stating that he had laid out a method, a blow, plastic bags, added weight, deep water, and confidence there would never be a body. Coming from a new girlfriend with no connection to Peggy's family, this was not the narrative they expected. It was exactly the type of let a nobody case needs. The response from investigators was measured. They treated Tina as both potential key witness and potential risk. If what she said was true, confronting him without strategy could compromise everything. So they did what experienced detectives do when it comes down to one person's word against another's. They asked her to help them record him. The plan was straightforward, not cinematic. Tina would continue her normal interactions with Eric and steer the conversation, when possible, back to Peggy's death. She would wear a recording device during in-person conversations and make monitored phone calls. The objective was simple: capture his own statements on tape, in his own voice, without pressure from police present. Those recordings, if they showed him reaffirming or expanding on the details he had already shared with her, could become the backbone of a prosecution. According to later testimony and reporting, that is exactly what happened. In a key recorded conversation, Tina confronted Eric about what he had done. On tape, he did not stick to the clean boating story he gave the authorities in 1997. Instead, he made statements that lined up with the private admissions Tina had described, discussing harm to Peggy and her disappearance in a way that sounded less like an accident and more like an operation. The transcripts would show hedging, evasive language, and incriminating concessions, but not a single clear exoneration. For prosecutors, it was enough to argue that his own guarded words, combined with Tina's account, revealed consciousness of guilt. Los Angeles Times. 2. Los Angeles Times. 2. Importantly, nothing about the physical side of the case changed. Peggy Beckler was still missing. There was still no body, no autopsy, no recovered weapon. The ocean had not given anything back. What changed was that the no-proof confidence Eric had allegedly expressed was now undercut by his own voice, captured legally with the cooperation of someone inside his circle. For a no-body case, that is as close as you get to bringing the defendant onto the stand before trial. From a human angle, this phase is often overlooked. It takes nerve to sit across from someone you care about, wired, guiding them back into the darkest thing they have ever described, knowing every word could determine whether a murder is charged. Tina's decision did not bring Peggy home, but it honored the reality that pretending not to hear is its own kind of choice. Many viewers of cases like this will have seen situations where people knew more than they were willing to say. Here, someone chose differently. Once detectives had the recordings, the status of the file shifted. What had been suspicious, uncharged disappearance became active homicide case with cooperating witness and taped statements. The prosecution team could now match those tapes with the early inconsistencies, financial records, prior comments to friends, and the carefully constructed opportunity on that rented boat off Newport Beach. One missing woman, one husband, one evolving story, now preserved on tape. Once investigators had Tina News recordings, the file stopped being theoretical. Those tapes, combined with her detailed account of Eric Beckler's private statements, gave prosecutors what they had waited on for years, evidence they could stand behind in a courtroom without a recovered body. The move to charge was not impulsive. Prosecutors in Orange County went back through every piece of the record. They had a missing woman, Peggy Beckler, who disappeared during a boat outing in 1997, no remains located despite an organized search, an accident story that never fully matched objective conditions, financial pressure and significant life insurance on Peggy, prior remarks about being better off without her, and now, from inside Eric's own home, a woman willing to testify, and wired audio to support her, that he had described striking Peggy with a weight, sealing her in bags, adding heavy plates, and dumping her into deep water to ensure no recovery. On that foundation, they filed a first-degree murder charge with special circumstances. The theory was clear. Eric had lured Peggy onto the boat, created isolation on the open water, killed her, staged an overboard scenario, and relied on the Pacific to erase what he had done. No extra drama. No invented forensic miracle. Just his opportunity, his motive, his inconsistent accounts, and his own words. At trial, the state presented a single, coherent narrative. Jurors heard from Tina New about the private conversations and the method Eric laid out. They listened to the wire recordings where he failed to return to the innocent boating story and instead made statements that suggested knowledge and control over Peggy's fate. They heard from witnesses about the couple's strain, the money issues, and comments Eric had made before and after Peggy vanished. Marine and law enforcement witnesses outlined why the accident account didn't sit cleanly with what professionals saw that day and what they know about genuine overboard incidents. The defense answered by attacking credibility. They framed Eric's statements to Tina as irresponsible talk influenced by drugs, ego, or fantasy, not literal confession. They challenged Tina's motives and judgment. They argued that without a body, without a weapon recovered, and without direct forensic proof of homicide, the state was asking the jury to believe too much from a woman who entered his life after the disappearance. Their story was simple. Peggy's death was a tragic, unproven accident, reinterpreted later through suspicion and a new girlfriend's perspective. In cases like this, the verdict usually turns on whether jurors believe the alternative explanation is still reasonable. Here, the cumulative weight mattered. The recordings did not exist in a vacuum, they fit into the exact gaps investigators had flagged from the beginning. The details about weights and disposal aligned with the practical reality that Peggy's body had never surfaced. The insurance and pressure did not create guilt by themselves, but they supplied motive. The isolated boat and lack of independent witnesses supplied opportunity. The changing stories and private boasts suggested intent and consciousness of guilt. In 2001, the jury returned a verdict, guilty of first-degree murder. The special circumstance of lying in wait was found true. Eric Beckler was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. No second ending. No later recovery of Peggy's remains. No reversal that transformed the case into something else. The official position of the state of California is that Peggy Beckler was murdered by her husband on that boat off Newport Beach, and that her body was deliberately consigned to the Pacific to conceal the crime. First, a no-body file is not an excuse to look away. With consistent statements, corroborated behavior, and careful work, the system can still deliver an answer. Second, people close to offenders often hold the key. Tina New's choice to come forward, wear a wire, and testify turned suspicion into a prosecutable case. Third, behind every legal theory is a real person. Peggy was not a plot device or a twist. She was a mother, a professional, and someone whose life was calculated against money and freedom by the one person who should have protected her. I've walked you through one hard story tonight, but it's not just about a case file. It's about paying attention to control, to threats disguised as jokes, to accidents that don't feel right, and choosing to speak up before someone disappears. If this episode moved you, tell me what it raised for you, or where you're watching from. If it didn't, tell me why. Your honesty makes this better. And if you want more real cases told with respect for victims, hit subscribe so we can keep digging into the truth together.